Joining me now for more insight into this year's two sessions, Neysun Mahboubi. He's a research scholar at the Center for Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. Good to see you. Thank you very much for joining us. You know, some people, let's start with the China growth of about 5%. Some people are expecting perhaps a little bit more, a little bit less. There's been an argument to be made that, you know, you don't want it too hot or too cold, and you want to give yourself a little runway in case things get better than expected. What are your thoughts?
Well, thinking about this new target of 5%, it's hard not to think back to the target set last year by Premier Li Keqiang in his work report a year ago of 5.5%. Of course, we know that China's economy only grew about 3% over the course of the past year. And that sort of, I think, indicates all the headwinds generated by, among other things, the trade tensions with the U.S., but also the zero COVID policy. So they've changed the target now to 5%. I think, obviously, in light of the getting out of the zero COVID policy, there's probably a little bit more plausibility to that. But at the end of the day, this still remains something of an aspirational figure. It's not, set in stone that it will be 5%, but it does seem as if they think that in light of leaving the zero COVID policy, it makes sense to still target something like 5%, even though this past year was only 3%.
The other highlights over the weekend, I think, a lot of media outlets are trying to read into a lot of the statements that are made from the Chinese administration, and quite frankly, a lot of them are, sometimes they can be very vague, and it's left up to some interpretation. And I'm curious, from the people you're speaking with, what is their interpretation thus far of what happened over the weekend?
I think the big thing that people in my circles are looking at is, first of all, obviously the transition from Premier Li Keqiang to the new premier, likely Premier Li Qiang, not, I think, formal yet, but we are anticipating that any moment for that to be formally sort of registered. That's a big deal, right? So, the party congress a few months ago sort of sets the larger scale sort of political dimensions of governance in China, but now we're getting to the nitty-gritty of the State Council and all the different ministries, different institutions like the Supreme People's Court, the Supreme People's Procuratorate. And so having this new premier in place is going to be very important, and having his team understanding who his vice premiers are going to be. So that's what I think people are anticipating. It's still not something that's been formally announced yet, but once we see, we probably know that Li Qiang will be the new premier, but who will be the rest of the team, we don't know yet. The other big thing that I think people are anticipating but has not been announced yet is there's likely to be a new round of government restructuring announced over the course of the National People's Congress meeting this year, more centralization of authority, a number of different things that are under the rubric of the State Council are going to be coming out and under sort of party institutions. And so once that is announced, there's going to be a lot of commentary about that. But at this moment, we're still waiting for that. We haven't seen it yet.
Politically, we all watch China very closely for a variety of reasons. And I think from China's standpoint, they have two very big audiences, right? They have their own domestic audience, then they have the rest of the world, so to speak, at least the buyers of their goods. And everyone's expecting really good things. And I think people are generally optimistic, but there are some very serious challenges. I mean, you're coming off the back of these COVID restrictions the last couple of years, which has been extremely challenging for China. So at the same time, they want to project, obviously, a lot of strength domestically, and also to relieve some of the supply chain stresses that we've talked about over the past couple of years to the international audience. Will they be able to balance, essentially, and manage both?
Well, I think the way you framed it is really interesting, thinking about both domestic and international audiences. I think those are both very much in play right now. And for the international audience, I think the primary message is China's back open for business. That's what they are trying to emphasize in lots of different ways. There's no more talk of zero COVID. There's lots of talk of encouraging foreign business, foreign investors to return to China. I think that's the message, above all, that is being sent for international audiences. For domestic audiences, I think the message ultimately, what I was just referring to earlier, will be the continuing centralization of control over various aspects of Chinese governance under the theory, which I think is very much associated with President Xi Jinping, that for all the different challenges that China faces, in his view and the people around him, you need centralization of authority. Now, there's going to be a lot of commentary about that once it comes out, but that is clearly his view and the view that they're trying to express very clearly to the domestic audience.
There's also been the talk of the defense budget that was increased by, I think, a little more than 7%. And you hear some hawks making some noise about it, but having, talked to some experts about it, it seems like it's not a big deal because overall their defense budget is still relatively small compared to, say, for example, the United States. But that said, it is worth mentioning that it is a significant bump. And what does that mean when it comes to the defense budget specifically for China and our reaction from the West?
I mean, so I'm not a military guy, so I don't really know what the intricacies of the difference in budget really means, but it is very clear, even to a casual observer, that right now, given the state of U.S.-China relations, given the concerns in Washington about Beijing, given the fact that even things like cranes in U.S. ports are being viewed as potentially instruments of spying, that anything like that is going to play into the existing narratives in D.C. Whether that's fair or not, I will leave for others to decide, but it is clear that that is the kind of thing that will continue to fuel the rhetoric about China that is predominant in D.C. right now.
Yeah, it is a complex relationship, certainly. Neysun, thank you very much. I appreciate your analysis on this.